where IOM has engaged with the private sector. I think IOM realized, as many of you in the room, a few years back, that working with the private sector is a must in this area. They're a key stakeholder. Of course, government is a stakeholder, a key stakeholder, as well as civil society, but we were really missing, at least as IOM, partnerships with the private sector. And so in the last 5 years, we engaged in a private sector strategy and tried to reach out to figure out how could we concretely engage them in the area of labor migration. I think it's important, just a few quick statistics, and this is actually, let's see, how do we move this forward? There we go. Okay, more people on the move than ever before. I think some of these statistics yesterday, how many in the ASEAN region? Did someone say 600 million? Half the population under the age of 35, with 20 million regular workers. But of course, we know we have a lot of irregular workers as well on the move, particularly in the Mekong region. I did not put up a slide, but wanted to give you a statistic that ILO Walk Free put out last year on the estimates for modern slaves. And they had, in partnership with IOM, put forth a global estimate and came up with 40 million modern slaves last year. 25 million, which were in forced labor type situations. Of that 25 million, I think they said 60% were in Asia region. And what's so interesting is that half of those in forced labor, the exploitation occurred during the recruitment process, right? So we found a lot of those were in situations of debt bondage because of high recruitment fees. And so this was really an entryway in the last few years for IOM and to work with the private sector and looking at this area of vulnerability. So what are some of our kind of key entry points with the private sector? We have two projects specifically I'm going to talk about today: CREST, Corporate Responsibility in Eliminating Slavery and Trafficking, and IRIS, the International Recruitment Integrity System. Why are companies under increased scrutiny? Increasingly, consumers are demanding, that their products be made free of exploitation. So we went to companies and said, hey, this is good business for you to really engage in responsible business practices, and because you have so many migrant workers in your supply chains, let us work with you as opposed to against you to try to really look at your supply chain. There's increasingly a number of transparency laws that are being mandated by governments. You have the US kind of started it with the California Transparency Act, which mandates companies doing business in the US over a certain amount of money to put forth the modern slavery statements and the efforts that companies are taking to eliminate slavery in their supply chain. And then you had the UK Modern Slavery Act follow. You had Australia now has a bill, France has, the Europeans have put together more regulations through the EU on ensuring that supply chains are free of exploitation. And so we saw that as an entry point with private sector and said, hey, let's work together. We know migration, you know business, let's figure out how we can work together. So some of the tools that, this is just a slide to really highlight the business case for companies. Why is it important? Obviously, damage to reputation, government fines. Of course, if you're talking about human trafficking, you're talking about criminal penalties as well. Increasingly, you have the big brands that are mandating compliance with their codes of conduct. If you get online now, you can see any of the big name brands, whether it's in the electronic sector or the manufacturing sector, they're really mandating their suppliers to comply with their codes of conduct. And then, of course, you know, health and safety and occupational health issues. So what does CREST do? Build partnerships with private sector. So we're basically, it's an umbrella initiative where we offer an array of tools to the private sector. And that's really how we pitch it to the private sector. We can customize our tools to fit your need. So first and foremost, we offer training to private sector. What is forced labor? What does it look like in practice? What are indicators that you should be looking out for? And we train their human resource folks and then those suppliers within their chain to comply with the brand's codes of conduct. We also will do labor supply chain mapping because very often these companies maybe don't even know because they're using recruitment agents. They don't even know where the vulnerability is within their chains. And we had worked with a few companies that we're really shocked when they found out there were migrant workers in their supply chain who had paid 9 months' salary. 9 months. I mean, you guys can imagine what your monthly salary is. Multiply it by 9, and that's what migrant workers in this particular company were paying for their jobs. And so the company didn't even know. They were like, wow, that's not acceptable. We have to change that. So we work with companies to do the labor supply chain mapping for them. And then, of course, remediation. Companies have a duty. If there is harm that has been committed, they have a duty to remediate that harm. And so we've worked with companies to put out remediation guidelines on how you can assist the victim. It's not just about preventative measures, it's also when you find a victim in your supply chain, you have a duty and obligation to help that person. So these are just a few examples. Guidelines, training, labor supply chain mapping, remediation, and then of course we have a number of activities under CREST working with migrants to empower them, whether it's awareness raising or through other means, social media. We have applications now to really make sure that they have the specific information about their rights. So that's CREST. Happy to take questions on that afterwards. In terms of IRIS, I think you've probably all at one point heard about IRIS. IRIS is a due diligence tool for businesses, for governments, for workers. The purpose to IRIS is to promote the employer pays model. It's a very simple principle. Workers shouldn't pay for their jobs, right? It's a simple principle, but yet we see it violated quite often. So we're really promoting the employer pays model. It's the employer. We're not saying there can't be fees associated with migration. Of course, there are fees associated with migration, but it shouldn't be the worker that pays. It should be the employer. Here's the IRIS standards, respect for freedom of movement, contract, transparency, respect for confidentiality, and of course, access to remedy, all very important. And the number one key, obviously, to the IRIS standard is prohibition of recruitment fees and costs to the migrant worker. Some of the activities, we are now test piloting IRIS in the Philippines. So the government of the Philippines and the government of Canada have signed an agreement that we would test pilot recruitment agencies that are working in the corridor between the Philippines and 2 provinces in Canada. So we're looking at recruitment agents, building a specific subgroup of recruitment agents who are working in that corridor and trying to get them ready for, ultimately, the goal to IRIS is certification, IRIS certification. And we're right in the midst of that pilot, so we're seeing promising results in that. We have recruitment agencies that are very much interested in learning more about IRIS, complying with the standard, and asking a lot of good questions as to how they do that. So that was 10 minutes. Was that 10 minutes? Is that over? Those are just a few examples of IOM initiatives working with the private sector. I hope that was useful.
Thank you. we heard about the statistics.